Okay, I'm going to give a breakneck history of Palestine, and I'm going to focus a little bit more than usual on the myths of Zionist ideology. I admit I feel a little bit embarrassed talking about some aspects of Zionist ideology because for most of us it's kind of obvious. We're seeing all this genocide and these horrific pictures from Gaza of children being murdered. So it's kind of clear what side we should take, right? It's clear who's the oppressor, but the way these oppressive structures work is that around the vanguard of, the complete nut jobs, genocidal, crazy, messianic, whatever, you have this layer, like in academia, of liberal apologetics that construct many, many kind of like complex stories, and they usually have a bleeding heart, and they say that it would have been nice if there weren't so many extremists on both sides, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to focus on those myths that come from the kind of educated middle class. I'm not going to try to refute the complete nut job nonsense of like the land was promised to the Jews according to the Bible. I'm not going to waste any time on that. Just the more sophisticated stuff, because that's what we kind of see. All right, so since the year 2000, over 40,000 Palestinians were killed as against about 2,000 Israeli Jews. The perpetrator, the state of Israel, was established in 1948, the same year as the apartheid state in South Africa. But apartheid, as we know, was dismantled in the early 90s under pressure from both indigenous resistance and an international movement consisting of protests, boycotts, and many divestment campaigns that caused capital flight and undermined the South African ruling class. By the 1980s, apartheid was largely discredited and delegitimized worldwide. It took some more years to actually dismantle it, but it was at least considered like this horrible thing. But when it comes to Palestine, we're lagging far behind. Palestinians are fighting against the Zionist state, both using unarmed and armed resistance. Here, we're mostly fighting a war of ideas against this massive Zionist propaganda machine, and Israel is still widely considered legitimate as a Jewish state. Not here in this room, but in general. And what Jewish state means, even though you hear this thrown around a lot, it's not usually explained. There are many things you can say about it, but I think primarily it means that Israel enforces a Jewish majority by military means. It uses guns to maintain a Jewish majority. Because in Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs are a slight majority at this point, and certainly together with the refugees, it's a large majority. There are like 7 million refugees. So since we're surrounded in our workplaces, our unions, by either Zionists or people who are kind of afraid to speak up for Palestinians because they're afraid to be called anti-Semitic or something, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this stuff that, again, I feel embarrassed even talking about because I don't think it should be relevant, but the Zionist propaganda kind of made it relevant, specifically the history of the Jews and anti-Semitism and all this stuff. I'm going to go a little bit more than I would like into it just because the opposition has made it a thing and we want to be able to respond to it. Okay, so Palestine is this small region of 11,000 square miles, slightly larger than Vermont, but the crisis has global implications, in part because the occupying power, Israel, is a major component of the capitalist system, which is, as we know, a global system that not only is based on exploiting workers by capitalists, but also exploitation of poorer nations or less industrially developed nations by wealthier ones, which is what we call imperialism and what the capitalists call foreign policy, globalization, and things like that. I'm going to call it imperialism. Zionism, the nationalist movement that created Israel, has been embedded in and supported by Western imperialism from the very beginning. So I think it's critical to understand Zionism not just as a movement of Jews, which, yes, it is that, but it's also part of a global phenomenon of imperialism, and it cannot be understood by kind of like detaching it from that. So that means we can't just like focus on Palestine. We have to zoom out and see it in a global context. The region we call Palestine did not have precisely defined borders before the British and French capitalists carved up the region after the First World War, but for more than 3,000 years, the name Palestine and various cognates of it was used to refer roughly to this area connecting Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. It derives from the Philistine people who arrived in the region in the 12th century BCE, around the same time as the Israelites. Palestine, as the Zionists love to remind us, this is a big point of Zionist propaganda, had a Jewish majority until, depending on the historian, 4th or 5th century CE for sure, by some accounts as early as the 2nd century. And then the population gradually shifted to a Christian majority, and by the 12th century, it was a Muslim majority. In the late 19th century, the population of Palestine was about 500,000 Palestinian Arabs and 50,000 Jews, who were sometimes referred to as Palestinian Jews, even Arab Jews, because these two terms kind of changed their meaning and are unfortunately to a large extent shaped by Zionism. These two populations coexisted peacefully. The majority of Palestinians were farmers living in about 1,000 villages, but there were also towns such as Jaffa, the biggest city at the time, Jenin, Akka, Haifa, Al-Nasira or Nazareth, and Al-Quds, Jerusalem, which were home to Palestinians of many walks of life. This is also counter to what a lot of Zionists learned, that it was just nomads in the desert. Not that this would have made it any more legitimate to expel them, but this is kind of like the stereotype. Palestinian Arabs in the 20th century, much of Zionist propaganda is about kind of redefining what it even means to be Palestinian. The Palestinian Arabs in the 20th century were not merely the descendants of the Muslim Arab conquerors of the 7th century. Here he's responding to Zionist ideas, but the cumulative stock that included all the races that had entered and settled in Palestine since the dawn of history. They preceded both Jew and Muslim Arab in addition to incorporating them. They were the true Palestinians. Unlike the Jews, they had never left to return. They had been Arab in culture since the early centuries of the Christian era, but Jewish and pagan before that since primordial times. I should add, I'm pretty sure Khalidi would agree with me that when he talks about the Jews leaving and returning, he's talking about the diaspora Jews. I'll get to that in a second, not the Palestinian Jews who are a minority that are basically Palestinian, or were. Now, Zionist propaganda. Zionists refer to the Jewish majority of ancient Palestine to argue that it was home to the Jewish people. This is kind of like the main pillar of Zionist ideology, until they were violently expelled by ancient empires, Babylonian, Persian, and Greek, and Roman, and so on, causing the Jewish diaspora. According to this narrative, despite 2,000 years of diaspora and persecution, the tenacious Jews maintained their identity thanks to their wonderful religion and their attachment to this land of origin. And they were persecuted, what we later would call antisemitism, because they were a religious minority without their own state. And if that's what you believe, then what better choice for a Jewish state than their land of origin? So Zionism is presented as a kind of return to the homeland of refugees, essentially, and a solution to anti-Semitism at the same time. Now, this, as usual with Zionist ideas, is a mixture of truth and lies, right? It's true that there were expulsions of many people, and including many Jews. There are many Zionist historians who try to kind of like dig through very flimsy evidence, the numbers of the different expulsions and so on, by the ancient empires. But this is what the Zionists don't tell you. Although early Zionist historians like Rupin, you'll find this stuff there. They just kind of distance themselves from this uncomfortable truth in the subsequent decades of Zionism. And this is mainstream historiography, what I'm about to say. It's not, you don't have to go to anti-Zionist literature to see this. It's just normal liberal historians. Centuries before the Roman conquest, the majority of Jews were already dispersed in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Even as early as the Alexandrian, the Greek conquest, the majority of Jews were dispersed outside of Palestine, and by some accounts, even as early as the Babylonian conquest, each of which had expulsions. The exodus of these Jews, the diaspora, was voluntary. Yes, there were exiles, but the vast majority of Jews voluntarily left. The exile accounts for only a fraction of the diaspora. For the dispersed Jews of antiquity, Palestine was never a homeland. It was a holy site of pilgrimage, kind of like Mecca for Islam, for the Muslims. Now, Zionists love to cite the phrase "next year in Jerusalem," which is said every Passover and also Yom Kippur, I think, in the prayer books, as some kind of evidence for the diaspora Jews yearning for Zion. Zion is Jerusalem. This is absolute nonsense. For over 2 millennia, only a tiny minority of Jews chose to emigrate to Palestine, even though there were mass expulsions of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe. The vast majority chose other places of refuge. This idea that Palestine is the Jewish homeland and that they're kind of like perennial refugees is total nonsense. The main cause of the Jewish diaspora is not expulsion, but basically occupation, vocation. A large proportion of dispersed Jews, not Palestinian Jews, the dispersed Jews, the diaspora, were engaged in either trade or related occupations, artisanal occupations that are connected to trade. This, incidentally, is also the main cause of anti-Jewish hatred, which from the 19th century is called antisemitism. The hatred towards merchants in pre-capitalist societies. And there are other examples of this. For example, recent examples are the racism against Armenians. By the late 19th century, it's not that the majority of Armenians were engaged in trade, but like there was a merchant elite, as it's sometimes called in the liberal historia field, 20%. And as you know, they suffered a horrific genocide under the Ottomans. And another example is the Roma or Romani people, sometimes colloquially in the past known as gypsies, but that's not the proper term, Romani people, who were sent to the same death camps as the Jews by the Nazis. Also, this kind of stereotype that comes from predisposition towards mercantile activity. And again, it's not necessarily the majority. These are stereotypes. We're talking about racism. It's usually an exaggeration. So this diaspora of the Jews, which is a big deal for Zionists, right, is the key to understanding both the prejudice against them, anti-Semitism, and their persistence as a distinct group for over 2 millennia. They performed these important economic functions as merchants and later other related forms of capital in pre-capitalist economies. As Jewish Belgian revolutionary Abraham Leon wrote before being sent to Auschwitz at the age of 26, if the Jews have been preserved, it was not despite their dispersion, that is not despite the diaspora, but because of it. If the Jews had remained in Palestine, there is no reason to believe that their fate would have been any different from that of the other nations of antiquity. Assimilation is what he means. And in fact, the early Zionist leaders, in particular Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, all these founding fathers of the state of Israel, actually believed that the Palestinians of today, the Palestinian Arabs of today, are descendants of the Asian Hebrews who converted to Christianity and then Islam. And later, Zionists kind of moved away from this idea for obvious reasons. Okay, back to anti-Semitism. As capitalism developed within feudal society in Europe from the 11th century onwards, it's not a precise line, but roughly, many Jewish merchants transitioned to other forms of capital, most unfortunately usury and land ownership. Again, not always the majority, it depends on the time and place, which exacerbated anti-Semitism and in some cases was codified into law, especially in the case of usury. And aristocrats who borrowed from Jews repeatedly massacred them to erase their debt. And they rallied peasants against them by portraying the Jews as greedy and evil, which is the basis of these stereotypes that persist to this day against Jews. And this was a way to deflect the anger of peasants away from the real exploiters, which is the feudal aristocracy. And with the rise of Christian merchants, a few centuries later, 13th to 15th century in Europe, the Jews became economically obsolete as a distinct group. They lost their protections that they usually had from kings, and they were exiled en masse from Western Europe, from many countries, and their population shifted to the east. And a large population of Jews prospered in Eastern Europe until the 19th century, when industrial capitalism made its way from the West to Eastern Europe. And that brought about the economic downfall of the Eastern European Jews. They were reduced to poor, isolated, kind of segregated communities with very high unemployment rates. And as the socialist movement swept across Europe, the Jews were scapegoated now by the capitalist ruling class and monarchies to the extent that they existed, the relics of feudalism, like the Tsar in Russia. And there was a sharp rise in anti-Semitism, and many bloody massacres against Jews, pogroms, were carried out in the Russian Empire especially. Some of the most violent pogroms were in response to the 1905 Russian Revolution, and 5 million Jews escaped Eastern Europe to Western Europe and to the United States, a tiny minority to Palestine. The upsurge of anti-Semitism in Europe brought two main political responses among Jews: Zionism and socialism. From the late 19th century until the rise of fascism, Zionism was a tiny fringe minority among Jews. Most Jews who became politically active at all understood that anti-Semitism is a side effect of class conflict and that Jews can only be free when the working class is free. So socialism was much more attractive among Eastern European Jews and Western European Jews. Zionism was a form of nationalism, in other words, a capitalist approach that echoed the anti-Semitic calls for Jews to separate themselves from the rest of society, and therefore it was just considered ridiculous by most Jews. The first wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine is called the first Aliyah, which is like first ascent in Hebrew, was in the 1880s and 90s. Palestine is still under Ottoman rule at the time. It's about 50,000 Jews from Eastern Europe and a minority from Yemen. Only about half remain, 25,000. And most of the settlers, again, against Zionist kind of ideology today, most of the settlers were not motivated by any kind of political Zionism because that did not exist at the time. In some cases, religious attachment, a desire to be around Jerusalem, but most of them were just refugees from pogroms, and in the case of the Yemeni Jews, from economic hardships. Most of them emigrated into the cities, and only about 5,000 into 38 agricultural settlements. The Jewish capitalist Baron Rothschild helped in buying some of this land. The Jewish intellectual Asher Ginsburg, also known by his pen name Ahad Am, this guy, traveled to Palestine during the first wave of immigration in 1890 and wrote a critique called Truth from Eretz Israel, Truth from the Land of Israel. It's very interesting, where he wrote, "From abroad, we're accustomed to believing that the Arabs are all desert savages like donkeys who neither see nor understand what goes on around them. But this is a big mistake." So you can see what the usual view that Said would later call Orientalism was among Europeans in general about those guys over there, the Arabs. The Arab, like all children of Shem, in other words, like the Jews is what he implies, has a sharp intellect and is very cunning. And if the time comes when the life of our people, the Jews, in Eretz Israel, develops to the point of encroaching upon the native population, they will not easily yield their place, which is very prescient and correct. In fact, contrary to mainstream Zionist history today, even the second wave of immigration, the second Aliyah, which is early 20th century and included most of the founding fathers, figures of Israel, was also in its majority not motivated by political Zionism at all. These first wave of immigration already show the roots of the conflict, which is why I'm focusing on them. Usually in histories of the conflict, you kind of go through this very quickly, but you already see the roots of the conflict in this first wave. The settlers bought land from landowners, which angered tenant farmers, falahin, Arab farmers, who were kicked off their land by these purchases. Many Arab farmers tried to go back to till the land that they perceived as theirs because they'd been working on it for generations, only to be driven out by colonizers who purchased it. These clashes over land are the basis of the conflict between the local Arab population, the indigenous Palestinians, and the colonizing Jews, which slowly escalated in the next few decades until it reached riots and armed battles, especially from the 20s onwards. The first riot that I'm aware of, that's kind of like not just a few people attacking a family, but an actual riot, is 1908. But it's from the 20s that you really see widespread riots. About the behavior of the Jewish colonizers, and he doesn't say this, but I'm pretty sure he's talking about the European ones and not the Yemeni Jews, but he doesn't say that. That's my kind of assumption. This is what he wrote. "And what do our brethren in Eretz Israel do? They treat the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, unjustly encroaching on them, shamefully beating them for no good reason, and even bragging about what they do. And there's no one to stop this dangerous and despicable impulse." The reason I don't think this was common among Yemeni Jews is that they mostly emigrated into the cities and were very poor. They were integrated into the lower layers of the working class in Jerusalem and Jaffa and so on. So I doubt that this kind of Orientalism and racism was common among the early Yemeni Jews. In the 1890s, Austrian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl began to actively organize for the Zionist cause, what we now call political Zionism, but I'm just going to say Zionism. The establishment of a Jewish state. That's what makes it political, as opposed to just yearning for Jerusalem and so on, which was a tiny trickle of people in the 19th century. He despaired of assimilation as a solution to anti-Semitism after the Dreyfus affair, when a Jewish French officer was falsely accused of treason and so on. So he said, okay, assimilation is not going to work. We need our own state and so on. The myth that I repeated earlier is explicit in his writings and in his diaries. The Jews were persecuted because they don't have their own state. He understood, however, that if Jews were to colonize Palestine, they would have to guarantee the support of the major capitalist powers of the day. In his manifesto, The Jewish State, which is the most famous kind of founding document of Zionism, he wrote, "For Europe, we would form a part of the rampart against Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. As a neutral state, we'd remain in contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence." This is completely true. And you saw this from the beginning. Herzl and the other founders of Zionism all understood that a Jewish state in Palestine could only exist with the support and protection of imperialist powers. So they appealed to the Ottomans and then the French and the English ruling classes for support in this project. In his diary, he wrote, Herzl that is, "We must gently expropriate the private property on the estates assigned to us. We'll try to get the poor population across the border unnoticed by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our country. The property owners will come over to our side. This policy would later be called, and still is called, transfer. It's just a euphemism for expulsion in Zionist kind of parlance. This foreshadowed the part about excluding the indigenous Arabs from the economy, denying it employment in our country. It actually foreshadows a major aspect of the Zionist colonization that was taken up by Ben-Gurion and other important architects of the Jewish state. Zionism is a settler colonial project that aimed to exclude the native population from the economy as much as possible, which is unlike some of the other more famous settler colonial projects, such as the European incursions in Africa, South Africa, for example, where colonization was based on exploiting the labor of the indigenous Africans, right? The founders of Israel tried to make it a Jewish capitalist society from top to bottom, Jewish working class, middle class, capitalist class, farmers, everything. This was not entirely successful, however. Palestinian labor was and still is exploited, but they were excluded to a large extent, and this is a major aspect of Zionist colonization. Just to give a counterexample, until the October 7th attacks, even Gaza had 8,000 work permits, and you have people kind of like going through checkpoints every day from the West Bank and waiting for many hours just to do a landscaping or something like that. Many of the houses in Tel Aviv in the 80s and 90s were built by Palestinians. So construction, things like that, menial labor, very low pay. This brings me to the first kind of like big Zionist myth that you've all heard of, which is that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. This is a major aspect of Zionist ideology, to see the Arabs of Palestine, the Palestinians, as kind of sparse and negligible, like human dust, like no attachment to the land. So this has been Ben-Gurion from his memoirs. There was nothing here. It was literally a forgotten corner of the Turkish Empire and of the globe. Nobody wanted it, certainly not the Palestinian Arabs who were placidly vegetating in their poverty under the Turks. When I came here, no one could have cared less about the place. There are many other pronouncements to this effect by other founding Zionists. The best one, I think, that really illustrates the kind of bourgeois ideology that is embedded here, the capitalist thinking, is this infamous quote from a Sunday Times article by Golda Meir, who was prime minister during the Yom Kippur War. So this is what she says. There was no such thing as Palestinians. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? She's right. There wasn't that. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country from them. They did not exist. So some of the premises are correct and the conclusion not so correct. What does it mean for the capitalist-minded person like her to exist as a people? It means to have a nation state, which means to have militarily defended borders, your own capitalist ruling class, exploiting the working class. If you don't have that, you just don't exist. No Palestinian people. Classic capitalist thinking. The fact that Palestinian identity was forged in part in response to European imperialism, that I'll get to in a minute, and Zionism, does not diminish from the peoplehood of the Palestinians. On the contrary, it means that it's a result of struggle. So this is Rashid Khalidi, the younger cousin of Walid Khalidi. Palestinian identity and nationalism are all too often seen to be no more than recent expressions of an unreasoning, if not fanatical, opposition to Jewish national self-determination, to Zionism. But Palestinian identity, much like Zionism, emerged in response to many stimuli, and at almost the exact same time as modern political Zionism. The threat of Zionism was only one of these stimuli, just as antisemitism was only one of the factors fueling Zionism. This identity included love of country, a desire to improve society, religious attachment to Palestine, and opposition to European control. This is from his book, 100 Years' War on Palestine. So to be a society, you don't have to have a nation state. To us, it's obvious, but this is a major part of Zionist ideology. All the Zionist apologia, all this liberal nonsense that comes from academia has this. There was no state. There was no nation state. Therefore, it's up for grabs. You can just There's no Palestinians. The struggle to free Palestine is a collective struggle to restore a society. That's also something that's kind of ignored sometimes in not just Zionist historiography, but in general, as if it's this individual thing. Like individuals want to return to their homes. Of course, yes, individuals are refugees, but there's also a society that was not completely, but largely destroyed by Zionism that Palestinians want to restore in their homeland. So it's a social issue. Okay, back to the history of Palestine and imperialism, which is critical. The First World War ended with the defeat of the Ottomans. The French and British won, and they divided the territories according to Sykes-Picot, and then it changed. This is actually the Sykes-Picot agreement, but as you can see, Palestine is half French, half British, and then they did a little deal, and it became all British. The French got something else in Lebanon. I don't remember. It was an adaptation, but the British got all of Palestine, the French got Lebanon and Syria to the north, and so on. Of course, the main resource at stake was oil, petroleum, that was becoming the main fuel of modern industrial capitalism. Winston Churchill, in an extremely anti-Semitic article from 1920, wrote this: "If there should be created in our own lifetime by the banks of the Jordan a Jewish state under the protection of the British Crown, this would, from every point of view, be beneficial and would be especially in harmony with the truest interests of the British Empire." So under the auspices of the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, the intent laid out in the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was codified in the so-called British Mandate for Palestine, which is this. The Balfour Declaration was just a letter from Lord Balfour to Rothschild saying, yeah, we support your thing, national home for Jews and so on. This mandate, the document was published in 1922, even though the British had already made it kind of a fact on the ground since 1918 when they conquered the region. A lot of work was put into it. Drafts were sent back and forth and corrected and amended. No Palestinian was ever consulted in drafting this. They're not even mentioned, actually. It says non-Jewish population, but it doesn't say Arabs or Palestinians. They're just not mentioned. The stated aim of this mandate and highlight is to establish a national home for the Jewish people. And this despite the fact that even the British census of 1922 counted 700,000 inhabitants, 88% Arab and 11% Jews. The British mandate was crucial in lifting the Zionist movement from its marginal status. It was largely unsuccessful as a colonization movement before the 20s. It was crisis-ridden and it just would not have worked without the British. The British laid the foundations for the steady influx of capital from Europe and the consolidation of a Jewish middle and working class in Palestine. A big Jewish bourgeoisie would come later. This is a perfect example of what Marxists call original accumulation, or primitive accumulation is the old term. With British support, the Zionists established a proto-state called the Jewish Agency, as per the British mandate's stated aim of developing self-governing institutions, and the Jewish Agency would later morph into the Israeli government. The Jewish population, this is an early settlement in Palestine, rose from 9% to 27% of the population in the 20s and early 30s, displacing tens of thousands of Palestinians through land purchase. The British assisted this process by shutting down a Palestinian agricultural bank, raising taxes on farmers, the Falachin, which compelled them to sell their land. And the early Zionists were actually explicit about this being a colonial project. The word colonialism was used. It wasn't a bad word at the time. For them, it just meant bringing European civilization, which is capitalism, to the East, which they saw would benefit the people because, that's how it's the kind of manifest destiny kind of thinking that it's going to help the natives and so on. And they were very proud of it. And the colonizers relied on the existing class structure in Palestine, first under the Ottomans, but especially under the British, to kick farmers off their land by buying it, mostly legally. Under the Ottomans, there was some bribery that they had to do because the Ottomans were more opposed to Jewish immigration. But under the British, it was mostly just buying land. So to give an idea of what the agrarian class structure looked like under Ottoman control, while the peasants perceived their right to their land to be based on long-standing possession and cultivation, I'm quoting an historian, Stephen Halbrook, the Ottoman Code regarded the ultimate landowner to be the Sultan, whose agents would terminate tenure for non-payment of taxes or rent. Falachin were severely exploited by tax farmers, tax collectors, who, backed by troops, doubled as moneylenders at rates of 60% interest. And not surprisingly, the Ottoman state, was regarded as an organized band of robbers. And under British occupation, it became much easier for the Zionists, and even more legally, they didn't have to bribe anyone. But to this day, this is one of the most popular Zionist talking points, that we just bought the land legally. We just bought it. What's the problem? And this demonstrates that there can be colonization by purchase. You can use an existing mode of exploitation, property relations, the fact that you can have absentee landlords. It wasn't the majority, but there were many absentee landlords. Rich Arab families who lived in Cairo and Damascus and Beirut and just rented the land, right? But as far as the Falachin were concerned, it was their land. They had to pay taxes, but it was their land. They had been on it for generations. So if you have a little bit more capital, because you collect donations from Europe, it's not that most of the Jewish incomers were super rich. They were mostly refugees, but they had institutions. They pooled funds. They had Rothschild in the early instance, helping by buying land. So it's colonialism by purchase. At this stage, later on, it'll become much more violent. Even though at the beginning, Zionists were kind of okay calling it colonialism, the term is now, it's fallen into disrepute, especially in the post-Second World War period. Now it has negative connotations. More people are aware of how violent it is. So Zionist discourse kind of changed. And now we hear that Zionism is not a settler colonial project because the settlers were not rich. The agricultural settlers had to work the land themselves. It's not that they came in with a Cecil Rhodes or a King Leopold and just like enslaved everyone or something like that. The closest figure to like big capital behind this was Rothschild, but the British were really the main kind of facilitator. Also, he didn't make any profits. He just kind of bought land and then turned over all the land that he had in 1901 and made no profit, just gave it to the Zionists, and they continued from there. And this was before the British. The Zionist narrative is that colonialism only happens when powerful empires impose brutal exploitation or slavery on native populations by force. And in this case, because it was a colonialism by purchase, it was very gradual, piecemeal, and erupting later in riots and violence and so on. And again, it shows us that if you have these property relations, you can own land without using it and so on. And someone can come in with more capital and just displace you, not individually, but thousands and thousands of people can do that. We are familiar with a very similar phenomenon here with gentrification, right? It's not necessarily very rich people who come in. And when they come in, let's say people coming in to get tech jobs in San Francisco, as far as I know, they don't come with the intention to kick out Black people from San Francisco, right? But that's the effect, right? And I really like this quote from Ian Black in his book, Enemies and Neighbors. Zionists have tended to focus on their intentions in immigrating to Palestine. We were refugees. We didn't mean to kick anyone out. There was anti-Semitic persecution in Europe. We had no choice. All of that is true. For most of the members, not so much the leaders who had more nefarious intentions. I'll get to that. But most of the people coming in, like my grandparents are example of that. They just escaped anti-Semitic persecution, and those who didn't died in the Holocaust. Arabs focus on the results, right? And especially in the words of Edward Said, on having their territory settled by foreigners. The dynamic between the biggest Palestinian city, Jaffa, and Tel Aviv, which is like occupied Jaffa to the north, which was built by Jewish settlers, is a microcosm of the Zionist occupation, at least the urban setting, and Palestinian resistance to it. And it was a recurring flashpoint of riots. The first riot that I'm aware of, 1908, is in Jaffa. This is right before the establishment of Tel Aviv. They're just kind of surveying to the north of Jaffa. And this is a decade later. Tel Aviv was first a part of Jaffa because Jaffa had already existed and it was an Arab city. It became independent in 1934. But then after the state of Israel was established in 1948, it incorporated Jaffa, kind of swallowed it into a single municipality. To this day, it's called Tel Aviv-Yafo. It's one municipality. And actual gentrification in the literal sense of the word continues now in Jaffa. Arabs are being pushed out by just middle-class Jews moving in, and they're priced out. But I don't know of Zionist or even anti-Zionist historians who use the term gentrification to describe the early phases of Zionist colonization, but it's very similar. It has a kind of agrarian component and not just an urban component. That's one difference. The first riots against Jewish settlements, as I said, Jaffa in 1908, that was kind of sporadic before the 1920s, but incidentally, this is 1 year after the first Zionist militia, again, as far as I know, was formed. It was called the Bar Giora group that later evolved into Hashomer. This guy is the leader. Other militias were formed in the 1920s and 30s, and in some cases armed and trained by the British. In 1948, it became the IDF, the Israeli army. So but these are the original militia. always thinking of themselves as just protecting Jewish settlements from attacks coming from indigenous people that they did not understand why they were being attacked, or at least that's the narrative. This gradual push out of Palestinians was happening both in the countryside, Felachin losing their lands, their farmland, and in the towns, where a Jewish working class was being built around a modern capitalist economy, which not only excluded Palestinian workers, but drove Arab businesses to bankruptcy. Neville Barbour wrote in 1969, the Palestinian worker was faced with the high cost of living and the very high rents which resulted from the economic transformation of Palestine brought about by the Jewish immigration. His feelings were intensified by the spectacle of the handsome new boulevards erected in the more desirable parts of the towns, by and for the immigrant population, and by the acres of Jewish working men's quarters erected by Jewish building societies. Sometimes, too, he had the experience of being driven from work by Jewish pickets, and he resented the fact that the government paid the Jewish workmen double the rate for which it paid him the same work. In 1920, the Union Federation, the Istadrut, not really a union federation, more like the biggest employer in the country, was established and became the largest employer of Jewish workers in Palestine. When the government was created, it was the government and the Istadrut, but they worked hand in hand. It was an essential part of the Hebrew labor policy, sometimes called Jewish socialism, but that's not socialism, which was a state capitalist enterprise that excluded Palestinians from the developing economy while co-opting what remained of the socialist movement among Jewish immigrants. David Cohen of the building company, Solel Boneh of the Istadrut, wrote, I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism, that is Hebrew labor, to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union, the Istadrut, to defend preaching to housewives that they should not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we stood guard at orchards like this guy over here, to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to pour kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in the markets, and to smash Arab eggs that they had bought. To buy dozens of dunams from an Arab is permitted, but to sell, God forbid, one Jewish dunam to an Arab is prohibited. To take Rothschild, the incarnation of capitalism, as socialist, and to name him benefactor, to do all that was not easy. And these were concerted campaigns. Ben-Gurion was one of the architects of this Jewish labor policy. In 1920, you begin to see real large-scale riots and armed confrontations. The British military governor of Palestine declared publicly, this is 2 years before the mandate was officially published, but it was actually in effect already, that the purpose of the British occupation was to support Zionism. This sparked mass protests and the first clashes between Arabs and Jews on this kind of scale, which continued to escalate since. In 1929, the Burak uprising, started with demonstrations and riots and then escalated from there, and the British and Zionist militias brutally suppressed it. Okay, this is very important because Zionists, of course, use this as their main justification for what they're doing now. Before the rise of fascism in Germany, Zionism was a fringe minority movement among Jews. In 1903, for example, Weizmann, the first president of Israel, wrote to Herzl that in Ukraine, almost all the young students are socialists and bitterly opposed to Zionism. Socialist Jews were much more numerous in Europe as well. But in Europe, facing the threat of working class revolution, as we know, the ruling capitalists helped fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler into power in the 20s and 30s, who then crushed the socialist movement. And this defeat of the working class is what tipped the scale of Jewish support from socialism to Zionism. Zionist leader Sokolov wrote in 1933, Hitlerism, that is Nazism, enables us to convert all Jews to Zionism. Other Zionist leaders said very similar things. The Jewish activists who stayed in Europe to fight for socialism died in the camps in the Holocaust. And Zionism was a kind of plan B after the defeat of the socialist movement. Between 1932 and 1939, Palestine absorbed over 200,000 refugees when most countries severely limited Jewish immigration. And this is, again, one of the main talking points of Zionist propaganda. And in a way, the most understandable one, because I certainly have a lot of sympathy for this. But here's the thing. What Zionists will tell you is if it wasn't for Zionism, we would have died in Hitler's camps. The exact number of Jews who were saved by the Zionist establishment allowing legal and also illegal immigration when Jews had nowhere else to go is contested, but probably around 200,000. And that's true. Zionism saved lives in this crisis period of fascism. But it's used to continue Zionism today. It's used to continually ethnically cleanse, not to mention genocide against the Palestinians. That's the part that I take issue with. In the 1930s, Palestinian formed militias. This is way later than the early Jewish militias, mind you. An armed struggle against the British and Zionists intensified. The most well-known was Al-Kaf al-Aswad, which means Black Hand, led by Izzeldin al-Qassam, who's kind of a legend. The Qassam brigades are named after him and so on. Many of his followers were former tenant farmers who were kicked off their land by the land purchases or by the rising rents from the land boom of Zionist settlement. Palestinian protests were violently suppressed by British forces. In the 20s and 30s, many Arabs from neighboring countries also moved to Palestine. And I mention this because this again is a Zionist talking point. Even Al-Qassam was born in Syria and moved to Palestine in 21 because he escaped a death sentence by the French because he was organizing against French occupation that was wreaking havoc in Lebanon and Syria. So what's the Zionist propaganda? They say because many Palestinians immigrated, then again, the numbers are contested. But there was a growth that was faster than natural growth in the 20s and early 30s. Because they immigrated, these new Palestinians, quote unquote, are said to have no claim to the land that they would be expelled from in 48. So the logic here is that imperialist borders that are imposed on the area, there are these lines that if you cross the lines, you kind of relinquish your rights. And this is, Zionists love to cite this. If you just came here recently, why are you complaining that you're kicked out? This completely divorces Zionism from the overall context of imperialism and the enormous devastation that it caused, not just in Palestine, but the whole region. In 1935, the discovery of an arms cache that was destined for maybe the Haganah, it's not clear, some Zionist militia, convinced Al-Qassam to declare open rebellion against Zionist and British forces. And the British intercepted a group of his men and killed them all in a shootout. His death shook the Palestinian people. Thousands went to his funeral, and it started large demonstrations and riots and even a general strike in 1936 that lasted for 6 months. The strike was put down violently by the British and Zionist forces, and also the Palestinian landed elite had a lot to do with that, but I won't get into the politics of class divisions within Palestinian society, but that had a major impact. After the strike, the rebellion continued by farmers in the villages and countryside, and it took until 1939 to put down what is called the Great Arab Revolt or Great Palestinian Revolt. Hundreds were killed and thousands were exiled and jailed. While this was happening, in 1938, the British helped the Zionists create an Anglo-Jewish unit called the Special Night Squads, which attacked Palestinian villages. The British also trained and armed the Jewish Settlement Police, JSP, which had 14,000 fighters by 1939. It's hard to overestimate the importance of the training and weaponizing of the Jewish militia by the British, even though they pulled away from their support to some extent in 1939. This created a very good basis for what became the IDF. After this revolt, at the end in 1939, the British issued a white paper and kind of reconsidered. They couldn't deal with this level of Arab resistance, and they started limiting Jewish immigration, which pit the Zionist militias against the British. After the Second World War, as we know, the US emerged as the new superpower instead of Britain competing with the Soviet Union over domination of the Middle East. In November 1947, both the US and the Soviet Union were instrumental in the UN partition of Palestine, which allotted 56% of the land to the Jews, even though they were only 32% of the population and owned only 7% of the land. The Soviet Union also encouraged the immigration of about 300,000 Soviet Jews into Palestine, which was very beneficial for the Zionist project. Soviet support for Israel dealt the final blow to what remained of the very beleaguered Palestinian Communist Party. And other Communist parties in the Arab countries were severely discredited by this betrayal. Thanks to Soviet and US support, like flying delegates and pressuring other countries and so on, in May 1948, the Zionist leaders announced the establishment of their state and named it Israel. The UN partition sparked violent clashes between Jewish and Arab militias. Basically, many Palestinians found themselves about to be in a Jewish state that they didn't want to, surrender to, which drew in the neighboring countries of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Again, here, the support of the Soviet Union was crucial in the Zionist victory of the so-called Arab-Israeli War, as Israel acquired weapons from Soviet ally Czechoslovakia. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, which is kind of like our president. Their president is just a nominal position. Later recalled, without these weapons, we would not have survived. In the 1950s, as Israel drew closer to the European capitalist powers, the Soviet Union switched sides and began supporting the Arab nationalist movement, Nasser, and so on. We'll get to that. Even before the war with the Arab states, which is something Zionist history does not usually mention, Zionist militias carried out a terror campaign in the Palestinian villages, driving people out of their homes. The most notorious case was the massacre of Deir Yassin, the village of Deir Yassin, where entire families were murdered with extreme brutality. And just as news of the massacre spread, 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes and became refugees in Egypt, Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. So over half the population of Palestine became refugees. Thousands fled by boat to Gaza. This is Jaffa Harbor, and people drowned in the rush to escape the Zionist terror. Here we see hostages being taken to Jerusalem by bus. The mass expulsion is known as the Nakba, catastrophe, and the word is also used more broadly for the continuing ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians to this day. When the war ended, the Zionist occupation of Palestine increased by 22% compared to the UN allotted partition, and the new state of Israel came to control 77% of Palestine. Many refugees kept their house keys and deeds, hoping to return when the war was over, but they were, with a few exceptions, not permitted to return, and some were even shot at and killed when they tried to return. So this key has become a symbol of Palestinian struggle to return home. This is Handala from the cartoons of Najib Ali. Here are refugees in Gaza looking at the homes that they were expelled from. And on the right, we see an area that was captured in Jerusalem where the words Jewish shop are written on the left. And this is a Palestinian floor. So businesses were just taken over, just like houses were taken over. In Israel, the War of 48 is called the War of Independence and is celebrated every year. It's kind of like 4th of July, but way more obscene and rowdier. And all the streets are just like a huge celebration. There has always been, however, of Jews in Palestine who abhor the Nakba and continued violence against the Palestinians. Like, for example, she wrote in 59, if you really want to know what happened, we all Jewish settlers in Palestine who witnessed the fight could tell you how and in what manner we Jews forced the Arabs to leave cities and villages. Some of them were driven out by force of arms. Others were made to leave by deceit, lying, and false promises. Here we have people who lived on its own land for 1,300 years. We came and turned the native Arabs into tragic refugees, and still we dare to slander and malign them, to besmirch their name. Instead of being deeply ashamed of what we did and trying to undo some of the evil we committed by helping these unfortunate refugees, we justify our terrible acts and even attempt to glorify them. Another tragic outcome of Zionism, which again is exploited by Zionist propaganda, was the mass exodus of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, known as Mizrahi, which means Eastern Jews. Jews in the Muslim world suffered from occasional discrimination and even persecution, though on a much, much smaller scale compared to Europe. This also has to do with the kind of history of the Jewish people in the region and how they integrated into the economy, but I won't get into that. In the 1940s, however, anti-Jewish sentiment increased, and in large part from kind of government policy, as the Zionist movement was picking up speed and nearing its political goal of establishing Israel. When Israel was established in 1948, about 260,000 Mizrahi Jews were expelled and moved to Palestine. This exodus continued to the 80s and totaled over 800,000 people. And this is exploited by Zionists who cite the exodus of Mizrahi Jews as proof that Jews cannot live in peace with Muslims and must take refuge in a Jewish state in Israel. Now, this again completely divorces anti-Semitism from the violent expansion of capitalism, imperialism, and from its effect on colonized countries, which exacerbates divisions and strife, even between, not just between ethnic groups and religions, but even within religions. Most famously, I guess, in the case of Islam, the Sunni and Shia divide, which was made much worse in the 70s, especially after the Iranian Revolution, which is a consequence of imperialism. In the 50s, Israel shifted its alliance from Britain to France, which was fighting a colonial war in Algeria. Gamal Abdel Nasser rose to power in Egypt and led a growing Arab nationalist movement, sometimes called Nasserism, that threatened to weaken the control of the European powers over Arab countries. Britain and France desperately wanted to get rid of him, and Israel was called upon to assist. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been controlled by Britain and France. This act of defiance was celebrated across the Arab world. Israel attacked Egypt in response, and France supplied Israel with weapons and the means to build a nuclear reactor, becoming the first nuclear power in the region. This was Israel's first occupation of the Gaza Strip. Ben-Gurion later said that the main benefit of this occupation, this war, was to liberate, as they call it, the Straits of Tiran, which gave our country, as he said, access to shipping on a worldwide basis and independent of Suez. Nasser was not overthrown yet. Here you see him carried in the streets of Cairo after the Suez Canal nationalization. During the invasion, Israeli soldiers committed the Khan Yunis and Rafah massacres, killing hundreds of unarmed Palestinians. This is a not sufficiently documented massacre, but Joe Sacco actually went to Gaza and interviewed people and wrote this book about it, illustrated. In 1958, Fatah was founded, led by Yasser Arafat, organized guerrilla warfare against the Zionist occupation. And in 1964, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was established, and Fatah became the largest faction. Ghada Karmi writes about the importance of the PLO in her book, One State, which I strongly recommend. The PLO changed the language of struggle against Israel, making it one of anti-colonial liberation and part of the other national liberation struggles. It's hard to overestimate its importance as a foundation of our Renaissance and a beacon of hope for the prospects of regaining Palestine. In 1966, the U.S. provided $90 million in military aid to Israel and approved the 1967 attack on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, the so-called Six-Day War, to stop Nasser again. This war allowed Israel to capture the remainder of Palestine and more, the Golan Heights from Syria in the north, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and West Bank from Jordan. Nasser resigned after this humiliating defeat. Israel has been building settlements in the West Bank since, taking over most of the water and best agricultural land from the Palestinians. Now, this again is related to another Zionist propaganda point, which is that they define the word occupation to be the 67 occupation. And this allows the Hasbara ministry, the Israeli propaganda ministry, to say things like terrorism preceded the occupation. You hear from those campus radicals that the occupation preceded terrorism, but no, as you can see, there was terrorism, which is what they call Palestinian armed resistance in the 50s, but the occupation started, as every good Israeli knows, in 67. And most liberals who feel bad for what's happening to the Palestinians, Zionist liberals that is, advocate a return to pre-67 borders in a partition. In 73, Egypt, Syria, and the other Arab states armed by the Soviet Union now attacked Israel, in part to regain these territories. Israel was able to win the war thanks to a huge airlift of weapons from the United States. So it was a major Cold War victory against the Soviet Union. And since then, military aid from the United States to Israel has been increased. The US then launched the so-called peace process, which has become an ongoing attempt to normalize the occupation. In 1974, Arafat agreed to move towards a two-state solution under pressure from this kind of peace process initiative, accepting the logic of the UN partition of 1947. And here you see the result. As the PLO reconciled with the farce of the peace process, it gradually became discredited in the eyes of more and more Palestinians. This cartoon of Najia al-Ali has Arafat doing the victory with surrender, yeah. In the wake of the defeat of nationalist opposition to Zionism and imperialism, Islamic organizations expanded instead throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Al-Ali, by the way, was assassinated, and possibly because of that. The massive displacement of Palestinians into Lebanon brought conflict with the Christian fascists in Lebanon, the so-called Phalange, which erupted in a huge civil war that lasted 15 years. While this war was happening in 1978 and 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to crush the PLO. Thousands were killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. These are Christian fascists who look like teenagers celebrating after murdering a Palestinian girl. The war involved horrific massacres of Palestinians by the Christian fascists, such as the massacre in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in 1982, where between 700 and 3,500 people were murdered with unspeakable brutality, while the occupying Israeli generals looked the other way and refused to intervene. In 1985, the Islamic militant group Hezbollah was formed in Lebanon in the aftermath of the Israeli invasion. From the 70s onwards, Israel has become a world expert on counterinsurgency and border control, supplying weapons and training to many repressive regimes. They trained the military of the Shah of Iran, supplied weapons and training to numerous fascist dictatorships that crushed workers and farmers' movements and governments in Latin America, including El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Chile, Paraguay, and Argentina. Israel collaborated with the South African apartheid regime And in the US, hundreds of police and border control forces like ICE are trained by the Israeli military. Israeli surveillance tech is used across the US-Mexico border. Since Israel is constantly waging war on the Palestinians, it's a testing ground for new military technology used around the world. And it's in this context that the $3.8 billion a year of US aid to Israel ought to be understood. In 1987, the first Intifada, uprising in Arabic, or shaking off, broke out. It was a popular uprising of stones, barricades, improvised weapons, like kids throwing stones at tanks. But it also involved mass demonstrations, strikes, and freedom schools, because Israel shut down the Arab schools. Israeli forces killed over 1,000 Palestinians in putting down this Intifada, even though paramilitary groups were not involved. This was an unarmed uprising. In 1988, Hamas was formed from Sheikh Ahmed Yassin's charity and social services organization, Mujamma al-Islamiyya, which was established in 1973. After the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the US swooped into the Middle East, lost no time, invaded Iraq, and reignited the so-called peace process with the Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO. The PLO recognized the state of Israel, and the peace process distracted from the continued expansion of settlement in the West Bank, which, as you can see, did not slow down at all during the process or after. The Accords also established the Palestinian Authority to police the Palestinians in the West Bank on Israel's behalf. In 1993 and 1996, Israel attacked Lebanon again to drive out Hezbollah, which was shooting rockets into Israel. Hundreds of Lebanese people were killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. Before Oslo, according to Haaretz, the liberal newspaper in Israel, foreign direct investment in Israel never exceeded $1 billion a year. By 2000, $8 billion, and in 2022, $27.8 billion. The lion's share of this poured into tech, as they call it. By lowering Israel's risk profile, the peace process cleared the way for foreign capital to enter Israel. That's the major importance of the so-called peace process. In 2000, the second Intifada broke out, which, unlike the first one, involved paramilitary organizations, and many bombings were carried out by groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and even Fatah in Israel. This caused a wave of terror that moved much of Israeli public opinion to the right. Many liberals became rabid right-wing Zionists. I know some of them, which resulted in the election of Ariel Sharon to prime minister, who began building this 470-mile wall throughout the West Bank to separate Palestinian towns from Jewish settlements. In 2005, Sharon evacuated the settlements from the Gaza Strip and fortified the wall around Gaza. In 2006, Israel invaded Lebanon again. This is called the Second Lebanon War, but it's like the fourth at this point, I think. The war killed over 1,000 Lebanese people and displaced 1 million people. Hamas scored an electoral victory against Fatah that year in the Legislative Council. And after a struggle between Fatah and Hamas assumed power in Gaza, while Fatah, which in reality at this point, the Palestinian Authority, still controls the West Bank. The blockade around Gaza tightened in 2007. Israel reduced the work permits to 18,000. In December 2008, Israel launched a 3-week assault on Gaza, killing over 1,000 people. In 2014, a 7-week assault killed over 2,000 people. In 2012, Israel bombed a soccer field, COVID testing center in 2021, schools, clinics, hospitals, water supply systems, including a desalination plant, media offices, bookstores, in other words, things that are not even strategic targets to attempt to demoralize and destroy a people. The war on Gaza on the West Bank is coupled with an economic war. Israel destroys the local economies by flooding their markets with cheap Israeli products, and they use military collaborators, Palestinian military collaborators, as importers and distributors. So they were able to consolidate a kind of Palestinian capitalist class that's loyal to Israel. So this conflict is usually described simply as kind of Israeli Jews versus Palestinian Arabs. I think it's more accurate, however, to see Zionism as part of the expansion of capitalism into the Middle East by using the Jewish nationalist movement and the anti-Semitic persecution of Jews to create a kind of loyal agent in the state of Israel to Western imperialism, a local ally against indigenous resistance. In Israel's first decades, its social democratic bent and largely state-owned economy, so-called socialism as they called it, served to mask the capitalist nature of the Zionist project. But since the neoliberal era, late 70s onwards, the capitalist nature of Zionism is clear. Now Israel is ruled by billionaires. The Palestinians have their ruling class of millionaires connected to the Palestinian Authority. Above that, Israel has its billionaire ruling class who benefit from the occupation both by Jewish the Jewish working class, and super exploiting, not to mention ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. And these, in turn, are a glove to the hand of the US capitalists and Western European capitalists who use the Zionist state as a police station in the Middle East. So to understand the conflict, we have to kind of zoom out and look to the global capitalist economy. And a last point on Zionist propaganda, what used to be called the Jewish question, the problem of anti-Semitism, was supposed to be solved by Zionists, according to the Zionists. The state of Israel was supposed to be a solution to this form of hatred and a safe haven for the Jewish people. But instead, Zionism is increasing, anti-Semitism is increasing, not only because of Israel. There's a general resurgence of the far right. It's a crisis of capitalism and so on. But it's also stoked by Zionism and the outsized influence of Israel over the US and other capitalist powers. So for those who are concerned with the fate of the Jewish people and the prospects of another Holocaust or some violence against the Jewish people and the alarming rise in anti-Semitism, it's really crucial to understand that the function of the state of Israel has nothing to do with protecting Jews, despite intentions of certain people. The real function of the state of Israel is to protect the capitalist class. That doesn't mean that Palestinians have to wait for a socialist revolution, for their emancipation. Of course, we have immediate demands today that we're fighting for: removing the blockade on Gaza, rebuilding the Palestinian homes that are constantly being destroyed, removing the settlements from the West Bank, granting civil rights to all Palestinian people, which I hope it's obvious, includes the right to return to their homes and land. These are a few book recommendations. I used many sources that I didn't mention most of them, but this link in the center has like a text version of that. I can share this with anyone. If you want sources for any of the contentious claims, they're all there. And these books, some of them are very well known, some not very well known, but I recommend.